This is relatively a simple concept. In general, tickets are reserved sequence numbers. We already know that every account in XRP ledger has a sequence number in its sequence field, which increases by 1 whenever that account sends a transaction and that transaction gets included in a validated ledger. And remember, each sequence number can only be used once in numerical order. But tickets make some exceptions from these rules so that it is possible to send transactions out of the normal order. Tickets represent sequence numbers reserved for later use. In this video, let's read the documentation and understand the theoretical aspects of tickets. In the next video, I'll show you how to create a ticket and also how to delete a ticket. Now let's visit transaction types, ticket create, transaction type. So a ticket create transaction sets aside one or more sequence numbers as tickets. So this is a very simple payload. The transaction type is ticket create, and this is the account for which you are creating the tickets, minimal fees, the current sequence number, and the number of sequence numbers you want to reserve. In this case, it's 10. Simple and straightforward. But let's learn why we even need to create tickets. Let's visit this link. You can start by reading all these stuffs. Let me scroll down a little bit here and maybe read these things. There are some situations where sequence numbers are too limiting. For example, this first point. If 2 or more people are using the same account and assume that they are making a transaction at the same time using the same sequence number, as you can guess, only one transaction will get through and the other transaction will fail. In such a case, they can make use of ticket create transaction and set aside certain number of sequence numbers, and one user can use these reserved sequence number and the other person can just use the regular current sequence numbers, and that solves the issue. Next, you want to prepare and sign a transaction in advance, store it in a secure place, and execute it at a future point. Well, let me open up my editor, switch to this index.ts. Assume that this last sequence number is not present. This is optional, so assume that it's not there. So you know all the values for it, the destination address, sequence number, everything. You can sign this transaction totally offline and get this signed transaction value and save it in a secure place. Only at a future point you want to execute this transaction. Only in that case you can submit this signed transaction to RippleD. But before that, if you make any transaction, then that sequence number gets used up and the stored signed transaction, once submitted, that transaction would fail. In such a scenario, it's best to use tickets and reserve the sequence number, sign the transaction, and keep this signed transaction in a secure place to be submitted at a future date, and then continue to use your account for any other transactions. That solves the issue, and we should use tickets to solve that. Let's get back to the documentation. And the third point, well, this is interesting. One important use case for this is to allow for multi-signed transactions where it might take a while to collect the necessary signatures from multiple people. So if you use regular sequence number in this case, you will have to wait until you collect all the signatures. But if you make use of ticket, you can set aside a certain sequence number for this multi-sign transaction and then still continue to use your account for other transactions. So these are some instances where we can use tickets. Let me scroll down. Well, if you understand this diagram, you will understand tickets. So it's very important. So let's go through it. So assume that this is your account with its current sequence number as 101. You make a ticket create transaction and you reserve 3 sequence numbers and the current sequence number is 101. So you execute this ticket create transaction. So once this transaction is executed, this sets aside 3 sequence numbers. So this transaction used up the sequence number 101. So the reserved sequence numbers will be 102, 103 and 104. And then the current sequence number will be 105 because these 3 sequence numbers are reserved. So it skips these 3 sequence numbers now. So now for your next transaction, either you can use the current sequence number, which is 105, or else these three reserved sequence numbers. It's up to you. So let's look at a scenario wherein we use a ticket. So the current sequence number is 105 and we have these three sequence numbers reserved as tickets, that is 102, 103 and 104. Let's use 103 here. So we make a regular transaction with sequence number as 0 and now a field called ticket sequence 103 because this is a reserved sequence number. So once we execute this payment transaction, the reserved sequence 103 gets deleted. And one important thing is the current sequence number still remains the same, which is 105. So whenever you make use of tickets, the ticket object gets deleted from the ledger. Let me scroll down. One very important thing is each ticket counts as a separate item for the owner reserve. So you must set aside 2 XRP for each ticket. The owner reserve is 2 XRP as of now, so you have to set aside 2 XRP for each ticket. The XRP which is reserved becomes available again after you use that ticket. Let's scroll down and read what are the limitations of tickets. Each ticket can only be used once. It is possible to have multiple different candidate transactions that would use the same ticket sequence, but only one of those candidates can be validated by consensus. We know that it's the same with the sequence numbers. So each account cannot have more than 250 tickets in the ledger at a time. Well, this is interesting. You can use a ticket to create more tickets. If you do, the ticket you use to create more tickets does not count towards the total number of tickets you can have at once. Okay, for example, you had one ticket, you used that ticket to create 250 more tickets, so it doesn't become 251 tickets. Now the one ticket you already had is used up, hence deleted. So you can have 250 tickets by using one ticket you already had. So that's how it works. Okay, moving on to the next point. Each ticket counts towards the owner reserve. This is very important. So you must set aside 2 XRP. As of now, owner reserve is 2 XRP. So you must set aside 2 XRP for each ticket you have not used yet. The reserved XRP becomes available for you to use again after the ticket is used. Next, if you send 2 transactions, with one transaction having the current sequence number and the other transaction using the ticket sequence number, if you include both of these transactions in the same ledger, the transaction with the current sequence number executes first. Similarly, if you send 2 transactions with both of them having the ticket sequence number, the lowest ticket sequence number will be executed first if it's included in the same ledger. And the last one, to cancel a ticket, use the ticket to perform a no-op account set transaction. Well, a no-op, the code that effectively does nothing at all. That means no-op transaction. This deletes the ticket so that you don't have to meet its reserve requirements. So that's it. So in the next videos, let's see how we can create a ticket and also delete a ticket from the ledger.